Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you all are here. We have a really great panel for you to talk about bringing diversity and inclusion to disability coverage. My name is Jennifer LaFleur. I'm an editor at the Center for Public Integrity. We are a nonprofit investigative newsroom that focuses on covering inequality. And we have some great panelists today. I am just the cruise director today. Ola Ojewumi, did I get that right? Okay. Is an author, political commenter, activist, and in particularly for disability rights. While in college, she founded 2 nonprofits, including one that assists children awaiting organ transplants. Ojewumi, who's Black and has a disability, says she's experienced unequal treatment not only by people, but also by laws and institutions. Eric Garcia is a senior Washington correspondent for The Independent and an MSNBC columnist. He's the author of We're Not Broken, Changing the Autism Conversation, a book he calls a message from autistic people to their parents, friends, teachers, coworkers, and doctors, showing what life is like on the spectrum. And also Beth Haller, PhD. She's a professor emerita from the Department of Mass Communication at Towson University in Maryland and is a former print journalist. She and I actually interned together many, many years ago. She is a co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Disability and Media and author of Representing Disability in an Ableist World, Essays on Mass Media. She's also active on Twitter, tweeting about media disability stories, and we will give you all that information later. So we're going to start with Ola, and I've kind of focused each of the segments of this on, what can we do better, what are some best practices, and what are some resources, and so we're going to start with Ola.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ola Ojewumi. I am a disability rights activist. If you can't tell, I am a wheelchair user, and this is a result of having a heart and kidney transplant as well as being a cancer survivor. I was not always a wheelchair user. No, I was not born this way. I often say that, in my mother's, what do you call those? Like those ultrasounds when she's pregnant, there's not a wheelchair in her uterus. I was not born this way. I became disabled, and it gave me a unique perspective having once been able-bodied. And the major disability stories this year have often credited able-bodied people for the advancements that people with disabilities fought for decades for. For example, a most recent story is about how Gen Z content creators popularize audio captioning and closed captioning on social media and Netflix. In actuality, disability rights organizations sued Netflix and a number of other social media and major streaming services to provide these services, while able-bodied people are credited for our work. Next slide, please. For example, Netflix was sued by the National Association of the Deaf. Netflix was not providing closed captioning, and this was an injustice because people who are deaf have a right to enjoy the same entertainment that you do. 2 of the major global disability stories this year were Lizzo and Beyonce using the ableist terms spaz. This was an injustice because we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and thousands of people have become disabled as a result of long COVID, and hundreds of thousands of people with disabilities have died as a result of COVID. Yet, when disability is in the news, it's typically viewed in a white, disabled point of view as opposed to what really matters to the disabled community at large. How many people in this room know that 50% of people killed by the police are disabled? In the midst of this Black Lives Matter and racial justice movement, we aren't examining how people with mental illnesses, people with autism and intellectual disabilities are being murdered by the police. There is a deaf Black man's guide on how to interact with the police because they've been arrested for not being able to hear police commands, arrested and killed. Black men with cerebral palsy who walk funny or walk with a limp are often accused of being drunk, cited, and arrested and abused by the police. Why aren't those major stories? Why are we focusing on Beyonce and Lizzo? For those who don't know what ableism is discrimination, the false idea that disabled people are by default inferior, when in truth, disability is just another way for a mind or the body to be. We'll talk about misogynoir and how it exists in the disabled community. You've heard of misogyny, you've heard of racism, you've heard of sexism, but if you haven't heard of misogynoir, it is the combination of racism and sexism and a specific slight towards Black women. Misogynoir is when racism and misogyny meet. It is a dislike and discrimination against Black women. Misogynoir is not just limited to white people, but non-Black people as well. Black men are also at fault for this as well. Black men like Kanye West have used the term spaz. NERD, how many people know of NERD, our Pharrell Williams group? He had an album entitled Spaz. There was no public outcry and no demand for them to change the lyrics or change their album titles. This is not limited to Black men. American Idiot, if many of you don't know, there's a glossary online written by Lydia Brown of ableist terms. Terms like retarded, stupid, idiot, dumb. Dumb, idiot, those were once diagnoses for people with intellectual disabilities. There was an entire act called the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Act because people associated blindness and deafness with intellectual inferiority. We use those current terms commonly within music. When I was young, American Idiot was a popular album and song. The members of Green Day have used the N-word in their lyrics, and idiot, and there is no public outcry. So this is what misogynoir is, a specific focus by the white disabled community on, I would say, tearing down Black women in music and Black women in power, because Eminem, who's a very popular rapper, has constantly used ableist slurs in his music, but the focus is Black women. So, here are some tweets from prominent white women in the disabled community, one of which is Sarah Blohovic. She's a wonderful young woman, I know her. She asked, why are major news outlets reaching out to me about Beyonce stuff? I am a white disabled woman who does not experience spasticity. Sorry about that, it's a tongue twister, and has never been called that word. I won't touch that discourse with a 10-foot pole, and I'm not planning to. So instead of reaching out to Black women with disabilities, major news media outlets reached out to white women and white people. Hannah DeVinley is the activist who is Australian, the white disabled woman activist who started the Beyonce and Lizzo controversy and challenged them because of their use of the word spaz. Now, in my commentary, I'm not approving of the use of the ableist slur spaz. I believe it is ableist and should be removed from lyrics. What I want is nuanced conversations about why the media is pointing to only one sect of the disabled community. As you can see, she's criticizing Beyonce. So Beyonce used the word spaz in her new song, Heated. Feels like a slap in the face to me and the disabled community and the progress we tried to make with Lizzo. Guess I'll keep telling the whole industry to do better until ableist slurs disappear from music. She has been criticized for not doing this with white musicians, so it's not the whole industry she's challenging. So there are divisions historically between the disabled white community and disabled Black community. And we don't teach disability history in high school, middle school, elementary school. Black people were heavily involved in the disability rights movement in the 70s. In fact, disability rights leaders and activists learned from the civil rights movement. The Black Panthers were heavily involved in the disability rights movement. Yet, in response to this criticism, major news outlets like CNN and the BBC praised problematic white activists and gave them opportunities to appear on television and write op-eds vilifying Black women singers in a way they haven't done with white musicians and their lyrics. CNN's take. So, this is a little background information. that I will share with you. CNN contacted a well-known disabled advocate regarding this issue. This person was not white. This person was a woman of color. She told them, I will pass on this opportunity, but you can interview an actual black woman with a disability. CNN's response was, we will no longer be doing this appearance or this segment because the PACT Act has been signed. So I turn on the TV and I see CNN doing an entire segment, a roundtable panel with no disabled people discussing Beyonce's lyrics. This is white privilege in journalism. They sought the input of white and non-black disabled activists, and this was inherently racist, as it omitted the voices of black disabled people who experience both ableism and racism. Disabled white people still have white privilege and should be held accountable for their racism. Big Time Rush. So a week after the Beyonce controversy, Big Time Rush tweeted about their song Paralyzed and asking their fans to make it go viral. It became a worldwide trending topic and there was no backlash. The hashtag Paralyzed was used by disabled people with paralysis to meet one another and share their stories. The song Paralysis mocks disabilities like stuttering and being unable to move, yet there was no controversy. TMZ, I tweeted about this and publicly commented about it, and TMZ wrote an article about it, completely dismissing black disabled activists, saying, why don't you keep that same energy for white artists who use controversial ableist lyrics? Lizzo has sold 1.2 million records, while Big Time Rush has sold over 10 million. The idea that she's more popular or she's more well-known, it doesn't match with record sales. So their piece was dismissive, completely took my words out of context, and you can read some of the quotes. The arguments boil down to some in the ableist community and or their allies are actually just racist because they made a big stink when two black women innocently used the term, which is a popular and regular use pre-2000s. Frankly, but when a bunch of white/white passing dudes are more on the nose, there seems to be crickets in terms of indignation. Not everyone is buying this though, because yes, it's very accusatory and makes a lot of accusations based on nothing but perceived notions on Twitter, which is kind of silly. Next slide, please. So, how did I go from being a political commentator on PBS and MSNBC to being rejected for an interview by CNN? Yes, that story was about me. CNN got my information and declined to feature my analysis on the controversy. How did I go from that to being fodder for TMZ? Weeks later, TMZ reached out to me to appear on TMZ Live. I politely declined. This was likely due to the Kanye controversy. Why do you think this happened? There are a lack of disabled writers in the writers' room. And not only that, there are a lack of disabled writers of color. Newsrooms do not include disabled journalists and writers. It is not a field that pays us enough to be able to survive with good health insurance and the mounting bills we have just to exist. We can speak more than just about entertainment. We can speak about politics, education. We're in the midst of one of the more critical elections of our time, given that the Supreme Court has shifted and the majority will shift in the Senate and may shift in the Senate and the House. Yet we're being asked to comment on Beyonce and Lizzo. Change the newsroom, change the stories, and change disability policy as a result.
Thank you very much.
Real quick, Eric, before you go, I just want to say we will provide a link to all the materials for later at the end, so just so you have that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad that I heard that I got to listen to that, but also damn you for upstaging me. All right, so Ola did, I really appreciate Ola talking from the source side. I think what I'm doing. I think what I wanted to really outline in my presentation was more about the reporter side, how this happens, how bad information gets out, how media stories are framed, but then also how to change things. So I think that's what I'm doing. I think that my background was I got into caring about disability in journalism because I was born, I'm autistic, but B, I think that the other element was was that early in my career, I noticed a lot of the framing around autism was the sources who were being called were mostly parents, clinicians, researchers, but very rarely autistic people. And it kind of came to a head in 2015 when Donald Trump was running for president, and he said that autism is an epidemic, and he talked about vaccines. And my feeling was, okay, Trump is Trump, he's who he is, but there were very few people. But there weren't a lot of autistic people being quoted or called or interviewed around that. And that was also around the time in 2015, if you remember, there was the outbreak. How many people remember in 2015 there was that outbreak of measles at Disneyland? Parents who weren't vaccinating their kids or something like that. So that really got me thinking about how autism was discussed. So next slide, please. So who we interview really shapes how we think about stories. Journalists, contrary to what a lot of people might think, journalists don't like being know-it-alls. We actually thrive off not knowing things. That leads us to going to seek out a story. And journalists, but our expertise is shaped by who we seek as credible, by the people we seek who are credible. When we quote and interview so as a result of that, when we quote and interview non-disabled voices, that shapes how we see disability. When it's seen as something that when we quote parents of autistic people, or when we quote parents of disabled students, or when we quote inspirational stories about the parent of a disabled child getting asked to the prom by the prom queen or something like that, that shapes how we see disability. We see it as either, and as a result, we often see disability as either tragic or inspiring. We also see this with stories about filicide, where people with disabilities are killed by their loved ones, their caretakers, and that's often we see the stories about the parents were overwhelmed, they weren't able to, they tried navigating the system, and that's what led them to murdering them, rather than quoting the voices of disabled people. Explaining why filicide is so dangerous, and that in turn oftentimes leads to people with disability to people who killed their loved ones with disabilities getting a lighter sentence. So next slide, please. So some real-time examples. One of the things that was really fascinating to me when I started researching my book was there was a study from the Journal of Children in Media that examined coverage and publications by mothers versus mainstream publications. When I say mothers, I mean O Magazine or Good Housekeeping or a lot of parenting publications versus, I guess, what you would call mainstream publications like The Atlantic or Time Magazine. And there's a whole other discussion around how around why quote unquote women's magazines are not seen as credible journalism. I think I've found some of the best journalism that I've ever read in places like Vogue and Good Housekeeping and Cosmo and all that. But that's a whole other argument. We could talk about that during the Q&A. But one of the things that was fascinating to me was that the publications read by mothers often covered disability and autism as a dire affliction. I remember one quote saying that getting an autism diagnosis was like a gun to the head. And what was interesting is that a lot of these outlets didn't really interview autistic people. So that in turn, when you're doing it in the context of parenting, when these articles are about parenting, and make no mistake, because of sexism and because of the way that women are not welcome in the workplace a lot of times, women still largely take care of people with disabilities, whether that's caretakers, whether it's whether it's mothers, whether it's grandparents. That's unfortunately how it is, that it skews largely gendered. But when you do that, that in turn reinforces the same concepts about how autism and disability are unfortunate. Conversely, there was a 2020 study that showed in the Washington Post that went from, I think, 2006 to 2017, that showed that over time, when the Washington Post started quoting autistic sources, that actually led to more discussion of neurodiversity, accommodation, and accepting autism. And that just goes to show that when you change who your sources are, that changes how media frames autism. So next slide, please. So what are some of the obstacles to finding disabled sources? So Ola, you mentioned the panel, and you mentioned autism. So I think that, but I think one of the other things is thinking about what are the obstacles. So the first one, of course, and Ola is completely correct about this, is a lack of representation. Let's just put that on the table. Not just disabled students, not just people with disabilities, but a variety of disabilities. Also, people with disabilities of color, women with disabilities, LGBTQ people with disabilities. I think the other part is, so that leads to the next part, which is a lack of familiarity. Disability is not something, there often aren't many news outlets that cover disability as a beat. Or when disability is discussed, it is discussed in the context of healthcare, it's discussed in the context of science. It really isn't discussed in the terms of, I would say, of labor or employment, or in terms of business, or in terms of policy. It's often very siloed. I think the other part, so oftentimes journalists don't have the ability to create a beat on it. I think the other part of it is timing. A lot of times, a lot of times, journalists are working on deadline. We often, especially someone like me, I work at a newspaper. Used to be a newspaper, now so solely online. But a lot of times we work at dailies, and a lot of times it's very difficult to get the kind of turnaround, especially with people with intellectual disabilities or sending questions over email. That makes it harder to seek it out if we don't know. Similar, then conversely, I think there's the other, and that goes to my next point, which is a lack of media capital for people with disabilities. What are the reasons why organizations without disabled representation that are still quote unquote disability organizations get a lot of quotations from the media? Organizations like Autism Speaks is because they're funded. They have a lot of money. Whereas smaller groups like the Autism Self-Advocacy Network or the Autism Women and Non-Binary Network don't have the same media capital. Oftentimes they don't have the same connections. Incidentally enough, Autism Speaks was co-founded by Bob Wright, the head of NBC Universal, which is a news outlet. Take that into account. And also, Bob Wright happened to be really good friends with Donald Trump. He was head of NBC when The Apprentice came out. So that was another part. The other part is that also there are just unaccommodating circumstances. Oftentimes, so that goes to the point about lack of deadline. That means oftentimes we might just interview people over the phone. We might interview people in a non-sensory friendly environment. So that all of those things so that combined with the lack of people with disabilities in newsrooms all leads to really I don't even want to, sometimes ignorant coverage, sometimes outright malicious coverage, and then sometimes just generally bad coverage. So I want to so next slide please. So let's talk about those lack of accommodating circumstances. Part of it is that journalists are taught. How many of you are taught avoid asking questions via email? Or told that that's a bad thing? How many of you were trained that way in journalism school? And just by show of hands, I'm just going to ask, why are you told that you shouldn't ask people questions over email? Yeah, exactly. You're taught that gives them time to give a prepared response, or it's more canned, it's inauthentic, or it's or it's a PR thing, or allows them to have like a PR statement. Whereas for people with intellectual disabilities, or people who are autistic, or people who can't speak, or even people nowadays, you talk about long COVID. A lot of people from long COVID have brain fog, or there are a lot of people who might have aphasia. That's not necessarily related to COVID, but just in general. So that might actually allow that. So that's not them giving a canned response. That often gives them the time to respond. It gives them the time to do it. I think, and then oftentimes that can help, and that in turn can help people with disabilities. Conversely, it might actually help them give a more authentic response, because then it's not just flash in the pan or just what immediately they're thinking, or what they feel like they're forced to under difficult circumstances. That allows them to give, I think, a more holistic and more and a fuller response. So next slide, please. So these are just some of the best these are some of the best practices I've learned interviewing people with disabilities and interviewing and autistic people and non-autistic people alike. Take from them what you will. I'm still learning, so I want to emphasize that this is not the be-all, end-all. This is just what I've learned. So first and foremost is set up a sensory-friendly environment and ask what the best medium is for interviewing. Ask, are you better doing this over Zoom? Are you better doing this over the phone? Do you want to do this over email? What's the best way to do this, and what are you most comfortable doing? Ask how they see and perceive their disability. A lot of people with disabilities, person first or identity first language is incredibly personal. A lot of people say, oh, well, you should use identity first with people with intellectual disabilities, and you should use person first for, no, you should use person first for people with intellectual disabilities, and you should use identity first for autistic people, or vice versa. There's a whole other thing. But really, at the end of the day, what matters most is how that individual person prefers to see themselves. For example, a lot of older autistic people prefer to be referred to as people with autism. You can't really begrudge them for that. Conversely, a lot of younger autistic people, you see what I just did there, prefer to use identity first language. And then conversely, you see a lot of people with intellectual disabilities prefer identity first language. Again, you see what I just did there. That's how you get a phrasing like an autistic person with an intellectual disability. Then also make sure that make sure their voices are given priority. Oftentimes there was an article at I'm not going to call out anybody, I'm trying not to get fired. There's a really big newspaper that had a whole long magazine article about autism and self-injurious behavior, and it didn't quote the actual person who was the subject of the story. I think some people might know what I'm talking about.
Yes.
You know the article I'm talking about. You know the article I'm talking about, and you know
Exactly.
and you know why I'm trying to stay out of trouble. But the point that astounded me is that they actually didn't interview the person, or they didn't even take the time. They just interviewed their parents. They interviewed a lot of other people, but they didn't actually do that. And then conversely, I think, of course, I'm not saying that you can't interview non-disabled sources. I don't want people to say that. I don't want people to think that. But it's important to weigh those voices against the voices of disabled voices and frame it that way. See why they might do it, but then also make sure to get pushback from people within that community to say why they might not necessarily agree with the recommendations. Next slide, please. The other thing I think that I've noticed is that there's a lot of I can't speak for Beth and I can't speak for Ola, but I feel like a lot of times when journalists reach out to you, I can't speak for you guys, but when they reach out in the DM or in emails, there's a lot of nervousness, I think, particularly from a lot of non-disabled journalists. And a lot of my friends now who work in media, and I was talking about this with Beth, will reach out to me and they say, like, I don't know how to do this. I want to do this, but like, I know this is an important story. And my response is usually, okay, the fact that you're emailing me and you're asking for sources, that's like 50% of the way there. But I think what I want to say is like with any beat, disability takes time to perfect. You are going to get a lot of things wrong. Again, I was just talking with Beth before this. Is like what was funny when I was writing my book was that I went back and I looked at some of the transcripts from when I was first interviewing people, and people would tell me something that I would later realize was really important, but I just breezed past it because I didn't know anything about it. And that's okay. You're going to get things wrong. I think it requires building sources and building trust. Media, and then I think the other part of it is media. The ultimate big problem, ultimately to me, the reason why you get a lot of unpleasant coverage or not great coverage of people with disabilities is that media doesn't see them as news consumers. It doesn't see them as part of the community. Once you see a subject as a group of people that can read and can consume news, it kind of forces you to change, even subconsciously. It changes it because then you're thinking about, well, this person. One of the things that I thought about throughout writing my book is that, okay, once this book is out, I'm going to go on and live my happy little life. The people who I write about are going to live with that for the rest of their life. So I need to be, and they're probably going to read it, or their loved ones are going to read it. Even if they don't read it, their loved ones might read it. I've got to live with that. So, and then ultimately what you have to do is ultimately keep trying. Go back to the well over and over again. If you mess up, try it again. Call the people who say that you messed up. Say, how can I do this better? That's actually helped. That actually helped a lot. Early in my career, I wrote a few stories about the LGBTQ plus community, and even though I'm as cisgender and heterosexual as anybody else, but like one of the things that I said is I know that I messed a few things up, but I kept on DMing and I kept on calling and I said, how do I get this right? Why do I? And I care about getting this right. And in turn, a lot of people in the community understood that and they respected that. So in the same way, reporters can and should build trust. This is a build that we are, as corny as it is, we are in the business of people. We are in the business of telling other people's stories. and that is incredibly important. So building trust is important. It's the most important thing that you have as a reporter is trust. So that you'll balance my time.
Thank you. Beth.
Hi. Thanks for this fantastic panel, setting it up, Jennifer. It's awesome. So let me go through a few resources really quickly. I brought some in paper. So this is the National Center on Disability and Journalism's style guide in a paper version. If you want one, there's a few here to take. My card if you want to reach out to me later. Another card about a book that we didn't mention, which I collected Helen Keller's journalism, basically, it's her journalism. She wrote for newspapers and magazines in the 20th century, mid-20th century. And so it's a collection of her journalism. So you're getting actual writing from the perspective of somebody who's deafblind.
Mm-hmm.
And the magazine column is particularly interesting because it was for a women's magazine and nobody knew it existed till I found it for this book. So it's a lot of really interesting. And because she was Helen Keller, she could say whatever the heck she wanted.
Yes.
And she did. She was very into progressive politics. And the other thing I would start off with, too, is an add-on to Ola's presentation. So there's a book out that just came out the last week or so called Black Disability Politics by Sammy Schalk. And that's S-A-M-I is her first name. Her last name is S-C-H-A-L-K. It's at the Duke University Press. And yesterday and maybe today, it was open for a free download at the Duke University Press website. So I downloaded it yesterday, even though I've already bought a copy. I was like, I want it in my computer too.
We can add that link to the
Okay, cool.
presentation that we make available too.
And so I'm starting off with a little bit of information from Haben Girma, who's a deafblind attorney. You may have heard of her. So she has a kind of just a little list on her website about telling better stories, you know, and what we've all been talking about here, spotlighting disabled voices, avoiding assumptions about disability, and challenging yourself to not do that kind of inspiration feature, but to really dig into disability issues. Next slide. So where do you find these disabled sources? So you can still find them pretty much in your community, in your state. So this is a list of all the independent living centers that are in each state. You can go and find the link and find the local independent living centers. Independent living centers have to be run by more than 50% people with disabilities. So that's a great place to find actual people with disabilities who are involved with disability rights conversations. So they might know about transportation or education or recreation or all kinds of different topics. So you can find disabled sources there. And then the disability rights protection is called the protection and advocacy part of disability rights in each state. This just happens to be one from Florida, which has a really good disability rights Florida website. They even have a podcast about disability rights. And so those are really great sources. And of course, they have specialty information, like a place like Florida, where people with disabilities are harmed by hurricanes and other disasters. I'm now blanking. I think it was the Washington Post or the New York Times just did a really good story about something that nobody did about Hurricane Ian, right? Was it Ian that just hit Florida?
I think I read that piece. Yeah.
And you know, all the disabled people who died, and finally a story was being done about it. You know, and it wasn't a Florida media outlet that was doing it. Next slide. And also all social media, you can find people with disabilities. Go to the hashtag disability Twitter. And a lot of journalists do that. They just put out a question. I'm doing a story about X, disability topic, hashtag disability Twitter. Who has information about me finding sources? I found a source for somebody at ESPN who wanted to interview me, and I was not an appropriate source for the story. But we found two really good appropriate sources just by me putting out on disability Twitter, and they DM'd me and I gave them his email. Next slide. YouTube, tons and tons of YouTube channels, people with disabilities telling about their lives. One that I highly recommend is by a woman who goes by Annie Elaney on YouTube, and she has some fantastic videos about people with invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses. So that's a whole category of people that aren't covered because their disabilities aren't apparent. So you need to also have their voices in your stories, because if you're writing a story, I mean, you know, like a lot of the the community of people with lupus have tried to get in the news because a very important medication for lupus also can cause a medical abortion. And so this medicine that people with lupus needed was about to be banned, and nobody was writing about this. And so they were blogging about it and doing YouTube pieces about it and things like that. So people with disabilities and chronic illnesses are talking about these issues, and so you can hopefully easily find them on these platforms. Next. Bloggers, I can send you a list of dozens and dozens of bloggers. All my disability and media classes, they have to go and read blogs by disabled people. So it's authentic voices, and so you can just DM people that have a blog and ask if they want to be your source on a topic. This is Amani Barbarin, who does disability advocacy on lots and lots of platforms. I think she has a TikTok channel too. She writes, she blogs, she creates social media content, and from the perspective of a Black woman who lives in America with cerebral palsy. Next slide. So just a few examples. Some of them aren't even that active anymore, but still, they're all people with a disability that you can reach out to, and maybe they'll be able to suggest somebody that's perfect as a source. Next slide. Podcasting, still very big in the disability community too, and so there's lots of podcasts about disability issues. Accessible media podcasts, international podcasts.
Sorry.
And then finally, TikTok has, exploded among young disabled people too. People really doing their activism. There's a quote here from a 16-year-old who said she turned to disabled. TikTokers have found a problem on the app found a platform on the app when it first blew up in 2020, and so they were able to talk about their life and find other disabled people. And a friend of mine who has a chronic illness is from the States but lives in England right now, so she sent me a list of a lot of TikTokers she follows that talk about her disability. So that's it. I want to move straight to our Q&A so people can ask the questions they have.
I'm going to do it. We have a couple more resources in here. Here's and there's links to these in the presentation as well. More resources, and then there's a final link of dozens and dozens of things that Beth gathered. So we'll now open to questions. Are we? Oh. Do we need to record the questions as well? Do we need to get the questions on microphone?
That would be good.
Oh, okay.
Is there a mic to take out there?
If you could just repeat the question.
Okay, I'll do that. Okay. Yeah.
So I know that you had said that you weren't born with a disability and neither was I, so kind of working in the journalism field and navigating this new disability, I've tried to see it as not hearing loss but deaf gain, but it's easier said than done when you go into spaces where there's lack of representation, especially for women of color. Have you, or was there ever a time that you were hesitant to tell potential employers or your employers about afterwards, about your disability, fear that you wouldn't get employment?
You want to repeat the question? So I'm just going to repeat the question regarding a question for Ola about whether or not she would reveal her, make sure I get this right, disability to an employer because of the fear of, having trouble with job hunting because she has a disability. So.
To answer your question, hell yeah, all the time. A lot of people don't know that some wheelchair users can't walk, and I'm one of those people. When I was in college, I was named top 10 most influential college women in the U.S. by Glamour magazine, and they wanted me to sit in my wheelchair for the photo shoot, and I refused. I said, I do not want this to affect my ability to get a job outside of college. But when I was 20, I don't know if you're still in college, I applied for the American Association for People with Disabilities summer internship program. They pay for you to come to DC. They pay for your housing. They give you a monthly stipend, and they set you up in an internship in your field. I ended up interning in the Obama White House, and he employed disabled black women in some of the highest positions. The woman in the photo in the presentation that's wearing the Black Disabled Women Matter shirt, her name is Claudia Gordon. She's the first deaf black woman attorney in the U.S. And she was Obama's disability liaison. And in the White House, she was the associate director of public engagement and intergovernmental affairs. I used to hide my wheelchair in stairwells when I went to job interviews, because these employers couldn't see me. They only saw my disability. 6 internships. I was a public policy fellow at Berkeley. I'm saying this to say that it is so hard to get a full-time job as a disabled person, whether you're in the closet or outside of it. The way I found community was doing that internship program, the AAPD summer internship program. I was living with disabled people. It was the first time I met a black woman with a disability. I lived with 2 women, one black woman with who was a wheelchair user, and a white woman who was a wheelchair user, and they taught us disability pride, disability history, and I found my community. And this was before TikTok, this was before disability Twitter. So I want you to apply for the program so badly. In some, yes, it's hard. But my disability made my career. I don't think I'd be on TV if I didn't have all this stuff going on. How many people you met who had a heart and kidney transplant at 11 and then lived through cancer and then still went to college and still can speak about policy and still can do all this stuff? Not to say disabled people aren't able to do that, but it's very hard for us to even have the confidence to appear in our authentic selves and come out of the closet. I chose to make my disability visible because I just couldn't continue to pretend I could walk short distances, and when I can't, you know. In the White House, they had me going to the Nike store to pick up basketball shorts for somebody to play basketball with the president. And I was like, where y'all want me to go? I'll put this in high speed. Tell me. None of that would have been possible if I didn't have my wheelchair. So I feel you, and we can talk later too.
Also, DM me. We'll talk. Can I?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
By the way, I didn't realize you were a White House intern too. I was also a White House. What year were you? What's
2011.
What's the? Because I was winter, like January 2011 to like May. What year? What were you?
Summer 2011.
Oh my God, we miss each other. Oh my God.
Were you in OPE too?
I was in correspondence. I was in the First Lady's correspondence office. Yeah, but no, there were plenty of to your point, there were plenty of black disabled women in the Obama administration. The Biden administration hasn't done that much on it. Policy-wise, they have a bigger portfolio, but representation. But to answer your question about disclosing, because I'm an autistic person, I interviewed a lot of autistic people about disclosing, and what was interesting is there was a woman by the name of Marcelle Champy, who also goes by the name Samantha Kraft, and she's told me something that stuck with me, which is she says, I have never not regretted disclosing my disability, and that stuck with me, just because, you know, Beth, you could say this, like sometimes quotes just that you interview someone's just because like to your point about gaining deafness, a lot of people don't understand that immediately when you discuss being autistic. A lot of people, you know, there's a lot of hiring initiatives, and I've written about them. Like Microsoft has them, Goldman Sachs has them, Wells Fargo's starting one, SAP's starting one. But even then, a lot of people bring their preconceived notions about disability to job interviews when you disclose it. So like for the longest time, nowadays I have no choice. Like now, you know, people know I wrote a book about this, things like that. Like there's no way around it. But on the other end, like, I mean, for a long time, I didn't want, like early in my career, I didn't want to disclose it. And I should say, like, I should also be really explicit that is nobody's business but yours. Like that is like if you want to disclose it for accommodations, all that, by all means, do it. But if you don't want to, that is nobody's business. And there are benefits and drawbacks to doing both, I think. Because the drawback, and there are also big drawbacks to doing both, just because we live in an ableist world. The drawback to not disclosing is, of course, you don't get the accommodations. The people are like, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing the job the way you need to? The drawback, if you do disclose, is that people bring their preconceived notions about what a deaf person can do. You know, how can you even interview interview people, when like you know when you're hard of hearing, people immediately just give me, like, people all ask me all the time, like, how can an autistic person interview people, like, because isn't that a very social thing? I was like, very well, thank you very much. You know, but people bring their prejudices and preconceived notions to it all the time. So so also let's talk afterward. You have my contact info, but
I have another question then with that of, you know, how you said it's no one's business but yours, but, you know, there's some drawbacks to that as well, of not getting accommodations.
yeah,
I go to a school where, like, the accommodations office, like the student services or
Yeah.
disabilities office, it's more so there for a formality. And
Yeah.
they don't actually do anything, and they're very bad about communicating with professors and colleges.
they're doing it not to get sued.
Yeah, it did not get sued. And same thing goes for like jobs to where my employer knows about it, my editors know about it. But there's times with my, because I got my deafness from a chronic illness that comes
Yeah.
with symptoms, you know. And when I'm not feeling well and I know that an episode is about to come on, you know, I can't go into work profusely puking, feeling like I'm hungover. But it's like I can sense that they're, you know, they say okay, but they're not okay with me.
Yeah. You-
How do you navigate that of like
uh,
having raised it
wanna go?
yourself?
yeah, that is a really good question, because because I've worked in newsrooms for a while. Like, the thing that I've always done is that, like, I would always, like, even when I was applying for jobs, I would always kind of do, and I say a lot of people, do kind of a vibe check when you're looking for work. It's like, you obviously don't know until you're actually in that, until you actually experience. So, like, I'll be clear about that. But one of the things that I often did is, like, can you even, like, for an invisible disability, like for some people that people don't see, like deafness, like, can you even get into the building and get into the office in a wheelchair when you're going for a job interview? That's a pretty good barometer. Another one is, like, how many people in leadership, not just on staff, but in leadership, are women, people of color, LGBTQ. That's a pretty good measuring stick of how to say, like, I would be able, they would accommodate me, they'd be welcoming to me. Like, there are ways to go about it. But to your point about, like, your employers say they're fine about it, but they really aren't fine about it. That's, I think, where you have to. That's, I think, where you can sometimes find confidence in your like, do you have, like, I'm just asking you, do you feel like you have, even if you're editors, things like that, do you feel like you have colleagues who you can trust, who you can discuss this stuff with, or?
The only other person of color in the newsroom, because I'm an intern,
Oh.
and the full-time photo editor is the only other person of color.
That was, see, like, when I was an intern at the American Prospect, the person who I looked to all the time was Jamel Bowie. But I don't know, do people know Jamel, like, New York Times columnist? He was all, like, I knew him when he was at the American Prospect, and, like, this is before he became, like, the guy that he is. But yeah, just so yeah. But, like, it is but yeah, like, you have to, it is good to have a confidant and somebody who you can talk to and go to, even if you don't have management. So
Yeah, I would also recommend just hanging out afterwards.
Yeah,
And we can have one-on-one discussions probably out in the hallway.
we'll talk more.
Yeah.
And
we
can I
probably
add one,
time for
can I add one thing about that too? My understanding is the ADA covers you once you're an employee,
Yes.
but it doesn't cover you during the interview process. So that's a decision you also have to make. Once you're hired, then you can ask for all those accommodations. They have to give them to you.
Yes.
Because they've now have a disabled employee, so they have to abide by the ADA.
Yes.
But if they're discriminating against you as an interview subject, it's kind of a he said, she said situation, and it's harder to prove. So some people with invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses don't disclose, so they can get the job, and then they say, here's the accommodations I need. And yeah, that might anger your employer, but the ADA is there to protect your rights, and you deserve accommodations under this federal disability law that's been around since 1990, so, you know, you should be using it. But, you know, that's another position of ignorance I think that a lot of journalists have, is they don't know about the disability rights laws in this country, which are some of the best in the world. I would say the best in the world. Canada doesn't have a federal disability rights law. We do. And so a lot of journalists don't know that they're in violation. Eric and I were talking about the new Cubs Stadium and how, it violated the ADA when it renovated. And so that's a story for a journalist, and it's also, we need to be doing stories about these rights laws and what's happening so that people know that they exist and they know that they have rights, in their workplace.
Excellent. And
Yeah.
our contact information is here. The presentation is available at this bit.ly. We will be available outside the room after the panel if you have more questions. But we've run out of time. Thank you all so much. Thanks to our great panelists.